Tonight, Marjorie Taylor Greene's motion to remove House Speaker Johnson failed in a big way. Now the chaos in the Republican-led Congress is far from over, and many lawmakers are leaving because of it. Like my next guest, former GOP Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado. He stepped down in March after saying he was not willing to lie on behalf of his party. Congressman Buck, thank you for joining me. I need someone to explain what's going on in Congress, and I'm pretty sure you know the answer. What is your reaction tonight to that failed vote? What's going on?
Well, one, it's a huge victory for Speaker Johnson. I think that both Republicans and Democrats recognize that he is doing a good job in a very difficult circumstance. It also is a big loss for Marjorie Taylor Greene. She represents a small faction of Republicans that are marginalized now even further. And I think that the long-term impact of this is that Speaker Johnson will be able to continue to put together a broad coalition of Republicans and Democrats to pass important legislation.
She and others use this term unity party like it's an insult, it's a negative. But isn't that what the American people are looking for? Unity, bipartisanship?
I agree with you. Bipartisanship a few years ago was a good thing. When people could work across the aisle and there was common ground, it was a good thing. What Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying to do is send a message to the American people that the institutions are corrupt, that the institutions are against you, the hardworking American. I think that fails, and it should fail, because the institutions are made up of a lot of really good, hardworking people who are trying their very best under difficult circumstances, under very polarizing circumstances, to get good things done.
They sure are, sir. You said not that long ago that dysfunction was the reason you voted to oust Speaker Kevin McCarthy back in October. But didn't removing him just create more dysfunction? Think about the House paralysis during those weeks with the shutdown looming, Israel and Ukraine begging for aid, trying to scramble to get Mike Johnson confirmed.
First of all, there wasn't an aid package for Israel or Ukraine that was in the House at that point. The administration was still working to put it together. And yes, there was a period of time where we had to struggle to make sure that we got a speaker. We got a great speaker in Mike Johnson, and a lot of good work has happened since then. The problem that I think Kevin faced was he made a lot of promises about prioritizing spending and reducing spending. And he didn't deliver on those promises. He didn't have the Democrats bail him out because, one, he went back on a spending deal that he agreed to with President Biden, and two, he had removed certain members of the Democrat Party from committees and didn't get their support. I think Mike Johnson has done a better job of bringing the whole Congress together, and I think it shows in today's vote.
Do you worry, though, that he won't certify the election if President Biden wins? You voted to certify the election. Mike Johnson didn't last time around. And Donald Trump has said as recently as last week, he won't accept the election results if he doesn't like them. Are you worried about what Mike Johnson might do? He has a lot more power now.
No, Mike Johnson wasn't the speaker last time. He is the speaker this time, and he understands that burden. He understands that responsibility, and he understands history. That's why he felt so strongly about putting the Ukraine bill on the floor, was because he gets history. And I think that the difference, one of the differences may be that Congress is sworn in on January 3rd. There's a big question mark whether Republicans will be in the majority or Democrats. And if the Democrats are in the majority, it will most likely be Speaker Hakeem Jeffries, who will be making the decision on whether to certify the election or not, along with the majority party, if the Democrats, in fact, do win the majority.
But can we just go back for a second? So I feel like what I'm hearing you say is he was okay with not doing the right thing when he was just a congressman, but when he's Speaker of the House, he will do the right thing. Is that right?
Well, there was a political decision to make. I made the decision to certify the electors. Others, Congressman Chip Roy and others, made the decision to certify the electors. The decision not to certify the electors was, I believe, a political decision. They knew that the Democrats had the vote to certify the electors. They knew that Donald Trump was going to go after people who didn't vote to certify the electors. Easy decision. Just vote against it. and move forward. And it's not the first time in American history that we've had that. The 2016 election, there were Democrats who didn't want to certify it. It goes back years in terms of the party who didn't win the election trying to challenge the election. But in this case, obviously much different. We had a riot on January 6th. We had a much larger number of Republicans, both in the House and Senate, who decided to not certify the election.
Understood. I always just, do the right thing in politics, two different lanes. New topic. Nikki Haley got about 20% in last night's Indiana GOP primary. This woman has been out of the race for 2 months. Should this be a big warning to Donald Trump?
I think every one of the primary elections was a big warning to Donald Trump. I think that in New Hampshire, there was a similar number of Republicans that didn't vote. And the really interesting part of that is those Republicans who didn't vote for former President Trump were polled and said they will not vote for former President Trump. I think he has an issue in bringing Republicans to the table. Now, his polling numbers don't reflect that. His polling numbers in the battleground states are very competitive, sometimes ahead, sometimes a little behind with President Biden. But the number of Republicans who will not come home this election, I think, is going to be a significant factor.
Well, there's two more that we just heard about this week, major Republicans, Paul Ryan and Jeff Duncan. Major Republicans, lifetime Republicans, said this week that they will not vote for Donald Trump in November. What about you? Will you vote for him?
I've said I won't vote for a convicted felon. I am not making a decision at this point on who I'm going to vote for. I just want to make one thing really clear. That is Jeff Duncan, the former lieutenant governor in Georgia, not Jeff Duncan, the congressman in South Carolina, who is in Congress right now. But yes, I think that there are a number of high-profile Republicans who will not support President Trump in this election.
I get you haven't made your major decision yet, but I do want to ask you, Paul Ryan said this week, I just want to pull it up, where I have it somewhere here. Paul Ryan said that this is a character issue. Jeff Duncan of Georgia said that the GOP must move on from Trump if it wants to survive. I know you're not saying who you're going to vote for, but do you agree with those two statements from those two men?
I think there is the typical split in the Republican Party is between libertarians and conservatives. Now we have a third group, MAGA Republicans, who are supporting Trump and supporting Trump no matter what. He has a loyalty in the Republican Party that's unbelievable. He also has a vote that is hard to measure in polls, just like it was in 2016, that is very large. So I think that the Republican Party at some point will move beyond the strong personality that Donald Trump exerts, and will get back to the issue between conservatives and libertarians moving forward. So I do think that Paul is right in terms of how the Republican Party evolves in the next 10 years. But right now, this election, it is clearly Donald Trump's Republican Party.